I'm Datagram. This talk's on lockpicking forensics, and that's all I introduce myself with. What we're going to focus on today is how locks and picks and some other techniques work. We're also going to look at how normal wear, normal use of the key, normal use of perhaps a combination affects locks. We're going to analyze locks to determine what may have been done to them. We're going to also look at keys for the same reasons, and if we have time, we'll also look at the investigative process as far as it relates to forensic locksmithing. So the disclaimer for this talk is that destructive entry is still by and far the most used and most effective way to enter a building, enter a safe, yada yada. But the talk's not going to include any of that because to me it's not that interesting when a door is just ripped to shreds or when a lock's drilled out. But it's just a disclaimer. This is still the thing that's most used in reality. But for purposes of this talk, I find all the covert and surreptitious entry techniques a lot more interesting. So we can skip this, right? Everybody knows how this lock works? All right, well, real quick. Basically, this is called a pin tumbler lock, and it has a top and a bottom pin with a spring on top. The inner piece, that's a lighter, well, a yellowish color, is called the plug, and the outer piece is called the shell. When you use a key, what you're doing is you're raising those pin pairs, and as you can see, there's more than just one. In a normal lock, 4 or 5, sometimes up to 7, 8. What you're doing is you're raising those pin pairs so that they can split between the plug and the cylinder, and that's what allows that inner piece in your lock to rotate, and then that'll in turn contact the bolt or latch or whatever is actually holding the door or whatever you have closed. So the way it works is just like that. And it's real simple, and that's how 99% of the locks you're going to find in the US are going to work. So when we say we want to pick a lock, traditional lock picking exploits problems in manufacturing tolerances with locks. So you might think when we turn that inner piece, the plug, that we're hitting against all these pin pairs at once, and in the animation you can see them jiggle. But what really happens is that either the pin chambers are slightly misaligned like in the photo, or the pins are slightly sized differently, or they're oval. Various defects allow one of those pin stacks before another to be sheared between the plug and the cylinder when it's slightly rotated. And so the way we pick a lock is we use a tool to apply tension to the plug in the same way that when you turn the key you're applying tension. We're going to use a picking tool to find which of the pin stacks is binding, which one it's hitting first. We're going to raise the pin stack to that point where they can separate, and we do this for all the pins and it opens. Now the act of using the tension tool, when we properly split those pin pairs, it's holding that top pin up. So the way it looks is like this. We insert our tension tool, we apply a very small amount of tension, a pick tool comes in, and we probe around for the binding pin. So that was very loose. That one's also very loose. This one isn't, and so that signifies that it's shearing between the plug and the cylinder, so we know that's the pin that's binding. And it's just an exhaustive process until you get all this. And this is very easy to do. How many of you are going to be going to DEF CON as well? Great. How many of you are going to visit the lockpicking village? Good. Maybe I'll convince the rest of you by the end of the talk. And so that's how it works, and it's very easy to do. And if you go to the village, I'll be working in the village. I'm sure every one of you will pick 10, 20 locks by the time you leave. It's easy, and it's very effective against low security locks. So we come to this idea of forensic locksmithing, and it all kind of started in 1976. A gentleman named Art Baholke in the Chicago PD's criminology department, he decided that he was going to look at locks and safes and various mechanical access control devices. He's going to do all these different techniques against him that he knew, so that as a police officer and as an investigator, he can determine what was done to it, as well as he also looked at the effects of wear on different techniques, the evidence left behind. Unfortunately, not a lot of his research is available. Very little of it, in fact, because in 1976, there was no internet, there was no anything other than a couple locksmith magazines that are obviously still under copyright, and the majority of them are not publicly available, either in print or electronically. So really, there's these three resources. And the first one is Lock Safes and Security. How many of you know who Mark Tobias is? He's spoken at DEF CON a lot. He's spoken at various conferences. He wrote this book. I believe the first edition was in 1970, and for the last almost 40 years, he's been updating it. It's basically the Bible of locksmithing and lockpicking and surreptitious entry, and everything you could think of is probably in that book, as far as locks and safes go. It has a section devoted to forensic locksmithing, 3 chapters, I believe. There's also this book that translates to tool traces, written by a German fellow, but it's in German, so unfortunately, unless you read German, you can't get into that. But it is, I'm told, a very good book. I don't read German personally. There's also this book called Impressioning by Oliver Diedrichsen, and it's available in both German and English. The English translation's a little funny, but it does have a section on the forensics of impressioning, written by the fellow who wrote the other German book. The goal in modern day of the forensic locksmith is to, they arrive at a crime scene or whatever, and they evaluate whether or not something has been compromised, and if possible, how it's been compromised, any evidence that might allow investigators to identify suspects or even potentially victims. And there's also other things that they might do outside of crime. So we just went to the keynote from the Department of Defense. They also use, well, I don't know about them specifically, but government agencies do like proactive, I won't call it maintenance, but they have a forensic locksmith evaluate their security to determine, has anything been attempted, has anything been successful, even when there may not be, we're missing something or something we know went wrong, just as a proactive measure. Again, they can determine evidence, tool marks, techniques. A lot of times you can also determine the skill level of attackers, the number of attackers, a lot of information just from looking at these locks and safes. And from our perspective as forensic locksmiths, we don't really get into hair and fiber. A lot of the traditional crime scene investigation things are left to the crime scene investigators. We're really focused on locks and related equipment. So for the rest of the talk, when I say something may not leave forensic evidence, I mean it as relating to locks or safes. You could still manipulate a combination safe and leave your fingerprints, but that's one of the techniques that's very hard to detect as a forensic locksmith. The last thing that they do is provide expert testimony, either for one side or as an independent witness. Either they'll explain, if they're assigned to a specific case, what they found, or sometimes they'll be asked to provide clarification on a specific question that the judge or jury might have, because locks and safes aren't something that most people know about. You all know about it because you come to conferences like this, you've been to lockpicking villages, you've learned how these things work, but Joe Schmo doesn't know how these things work. It's just a magic box that secures their home or their valuables or their workplace. So we're going to look at what pins look like, Well, we're going to look at what different components in the lock look like when they're new and when they go through different states of wear. And from that, we can then look at different attacks and what the differences are. So this is one of the bottom pins from our example. And for most of the talk, we're going to use these type of pin tumblers and this type of lock. It's all made of brass, which is the most common thing. Obviously, there could be lots of different materials in both the lock as well as tools. But for time's sake, we'll stick with brass because that's by far the most common. So that's what a bottom pin looks like new. And up close, we could see that it's very clean. There's no dirt, no scratches, no lubricant usually. And you could see all the fresh milling marks. The key new also is similar, but the key's not manufactured to be as reliable as the pins, because the keys can endure a lot more damage, and they do, than the pins do. The plug, that inner piece, is also going to look pretty new. We're not going to see any scratches down the length of the keyway. The keyway is the hole that you're inserting your key to. At 100 uses, we start to see this track around the tips of the pins. And so what happens when you're taking your key and inserting it, there's nothing to stop either the top or the bottom pins from rotating. So wear distributes evenly across the entire length of the pin. So you imagine you're inserting your key, it's rotating, 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 and as well as when you're extracting the key, you're doing the same thing to the pins. So it's wearing down evenly across the surface. And on the photo you could see that's brass is self-lubricating, so that's what that track is. But that's also where it's wearing down. And up close you can see a little better. Basically, it's just slowly removing and polishing the milling marks off. The plug, that inner piece, when you turn the plug, remember our top pins are trapped up above, so they're going to cause tracks along the sides of the plug. You can see the plug's pin chambers there, and the tracks are where the top pins rubbed against it. Key is also going to show wear, but the key should only, in a properly made lock and a properly cut key, you're only going to see marks and wear down the center of they call it the blade, where all the cuts on your key are. And you can see in the photo that the slight black mark. And we're also starting to develop very small crevices on the key itself. After 1,500 uses, I should point out, because it makes me feel justified in having done this, I did this all by hand, not with some fancy machine. So I just need to tell you that so that it makes me feel better about myself and the time I wasted. After 1,500 uses, this pin 1 would be the first pin in lock. So when you're looking at the face of the lock, this would be the closest to the front. This is touched by more of the key than the rest of the lock. So if you think about it, when you're inserting a key, that front pin is riding the entire length of the key. The back pin's only getting touched by the tip of the key, right? So pin 1, it has a lot of wear at 1,500 uses. You can also see very light scratches down the center, and that's caused by our key, the center of the key slightly wearing down and causing those crevices. Pin 5 doesn't have the same level of wear for the same reason. It's only getting touched by the tip of the key. You can also see that wear is not quite evenly distributed, but we'll talk about that in just a second. There's also a lot more scratches on pin 5, and that's because, again, the tip of the key has the most wear on the key. And so that has more ability to scratch than, say, the back of the key. And up close, I don't have a close-up for the other one, but if you can look, you can see there's much bigger gouges on the key at 1,500 uses. At 1,500 uses, the plug's also wearing down. At 5,000 uses, pin 1's almost, can anybody spot a milling mark? Maybe one? It's almost completely gone, completely polished. Even the scratches that may have been made by a key are very quickly rubbed off at this point. Pin 5, though, we can still see some milling marks, and we also see this weird oval shape. Does anybody know why? Nobody? It's because pin 1 is allowed to rotate completely because it's being touched by the entire tip of the key, or the entire key. Pin 5 is only being touched by the tip, so it's not getting that full range of rotation that all the rest of the pins get. So it starts to develop this oval. Sometimes it looks like a figure 8 shape. Depends on the design of the pin. But it's always different than the rest. It always has some strange irregularity. In the middle, you see that's just the lubricant, that black mark. The plug, again, more wear. What we haven't talked about before is that the face of the lock also generates quite a lot of wear marks just from normal use. So we could see, how many times have you, sober or otherwise, missed your keyway? Right? Everybody's done it. And so you're not, spy versus spy. It's just a natural thing that happens. So after a long period of use, there's a lot of scratches and marks on the face of the keyway. Also, up at the top, there's this strange mark. So most pin tumbler locks are what they call shoulder stopped. So if you look at a key that you have, you'll see that that's the part that actually stops the key from going in farther, so that all the cuts are aligned properly with the pins. There's also tip stop locks, but the vast majority of pin tumblers are in fact shoulder stopped. And so this causes little marks on the face of the plug. And that's important for later when we look at some techniques that do cause marks in that same spot, but they look quite a bit different. Again, the key looks a lot worse now compared to 1,500 uses. Over time, what happens, how many of you have a lock where you have to kind of jiggle it or pull it out a little bit to make the key work, right? It's because over time, either the pins or the key or both wear down, so if they're not quite aligned properly, at that line where they need to split. And so you're jiggling it to hopefully get them separated at the right spot. So when a forensic locksmith gets called to analyze locks or a keying system, we're going to look at all the following things. And this is for a pin tumbler lock. Some types of locks don't have all these components, or they have additional components. But again, this is for pin tumbler. So we're going to look at the components. In this case, it'll be the pins and the springs, the plug, the inner piece, the cylinder, the outer piece. The cam or the actuator is the piece on the back of the lock that engages the bolt work. That's also very important. It doesn't wear down, which is why it's not included, because your key should never be touching it in a shoulder stop lock. Some locks, again, tip stopped keys will in fact touch the actuator so that they know to stop. That might be a different situation, but again, as a forensic locksmith, you just want to, you need to apply yourself to each unique set of components. We're also going to look at the keys. Keys are very important because obviously we touch keys, we put them in our pockets, in our bags, in places where the lock doesn't go, but that has a lot of trace evidence that can help identify the person. We're also going to look at the bolt work, any other additional things. You know, every door is different, so we're going to look at everything else that relates to the lock or keying system. We're also going to look at, obviously, doors, windows, walls, because those are very common places to enter. But again, we're not going to focus on destructive entry for this talk. So when we pick a lock, we're essentially using a hardened steel tool for both the tension and the picking tool to invasively manipulate the lock. So that's going to leave a lot of marks all over the lock, in theory, again. So again, we're going to see them inside the plug on the bottom left there. We might see some on the face of the lock, but that's hard because of what normal wear looks like to distinguish between the two. We're going to obviously see marks on the pins as well as possibly on the cam in the back of the lock. So that's what, before I begin, these are all microscope shots. This is probably at 200x or so, and I'm really like budget hacker. So don't expect like scanning electron microscopes or anything. This is like a $50 Chinese microscope. But with a $50 Chinese microscope, I'm able to determine almost every type of entry technique that leaves marks. Obviously, as a forensic locksmith, you're not going to be doing crazy stuff. You know, I'm not going to be running a scanning electron microscope in my basement or any of the really hardcore forensic stuff. Usually, you'll subcontract that out to somebody else who's an expert in it, because you know most forensic locksmiths aren't also expert forensic scientists or so on and so forth. So that's what lockpicking looks like. It's these very distinct scratches along the bases of the bottom pins. And so obviously we see that that's a lot different than every level of normal wear. Even past 5,000, we're completely polishing the pins, so it's not going to look too much different. Every type of pick will leave a different signature, I guess you can call it. In this case, let's go back. In this case, we see very long marks against the entire base of the pin. How many of you have been at a lockpicking village and you were told to rake a lock? This is essentially raking. Raking is where you apply a very fast scrubbing motion to simulate a wide variety of key depths for these pins. So that's what that looks like. This might be more of a single pin where you're attacking each individually, as in the animation. This one especially, we see very few deep gashes where they're raising quite a bit. Also, I forgot to mention, these 5 pins are from a lock that's been picked once. So it only takes one scrub through. You insert one pick once, and you will leave a mark for all intents and purposes. It's extremely hard to not leave marks, even as an expert lockpicker, which is something I think we'll get into in a second. So again, this is the back pin, and we could also see again it has less wear. And this looks more like a single pin picking thing. We're not seeing very long scratches along it. We're seeing very defined, clear points where they were raising the pin. A lot of times, you can tell the skill level of your attacker by examining these components. So obviously, this is pretty bad. This is somebody who really probably didn't fundamentally understand lockpicking, or they just didn't. For whatever reason, they just made a lot of marks. You also see the marks are very deep, a lot deeper than previously. What that tells me as a forensic locksmith, and it's a beginner mistake, is you're putting a lot of tension on the lock. And that's causing the pins to require a lot more force to be moved up and down, because remember, they're shearing between those two walls. So it's a very beginner mistake to do this, and that's what it looks like. There's also this idea of, well, what if you're just an expert lockpicker and you're really good, and being a better lockpicker, you usually apply less and less tension until it's almost a feather touch. This is the best I could find as far as lockpicking goes. You can still see right here, you could still see the marks. And there's various other points, and there's also marks on the sides in some places that you could see. So even if you're the best lockpicker in the world, you're still going to leave marks. It's just a very hard thing to invasively manipulate with a steel tool, and hopefully we'll have time later to look at anti-forensics. Every material I've tried to do it with hasn't worked, or it's left evidence in some other form. I tried fiberglass. Fiberglass left very few marks on some of the pins, but it left fiberglass dust all over the lock. I tried carbon fiber, but carbon fiber made pretty similar marks. I've tried brass, because everybody says, well, a key's brass, so maybe a pick made of brass wouldn't leave marks. I've tried everything that I've been able to manufacture, and everything leaves marks. I don't have time to go over all of them in the talk, but if you look at the website later on, you can see all the various things I've tried, as well as the microscopy from the examination of them. There's also, when you're touching the lock, you're hitting the sides of the pins quite a bit, and it's even harder to not make marks on the sides than it is the bottom. Because, while you're touching one stack, you could be inadvertently scratching another one. And it's very hard, especially when pins are in a very high-low combination. So you can see here, there's some light marks on the side of the pin. And to go further, these are marks that are going to be really hard to wear down. If the scratches on the very bottom, maybe you could use a key after you're done picking it 200 times, 250 times to wear those off. But the marks on the sides are just something you're not going to fundamentally be touching at all with a key. You can see here some more marks. So here, and these are very long. These are places a key will very likely never be able to touch. And they're very distinct. Obviously, a key's not very thin with scratches like that. Again, these are an example of a low-skill attacker. These are very deep gouges on the sides of the pins. So this confirms for me that they were using extreme tension, because this means the pin couldn't even move while they were scratching it. And from this, we're getting really good tool mark evidence. Some of their material from their picks may have came off onto this pin that we can identify. Some of the pin material may have came off onto their picks, which, if we find picks, maybe we can link them to it. The plug itself, if you look at your key, you'll see that the key doesn't ever touch the top of the keyway, because if it could probably not fit in the keyway at all, because you'd be scraping that piece of metal. So this is usually considered virgin territory, and it's a place where a lot of really distinct picking marks can be found. Again, in normal use, we're never going to see marks here unless the key was improperly cut, improperly sized. So in the photo, again, another example of a very distinct picking mark. The walls of the plug, another excellent source. Obviously, you could see that, let's say, obviously your key's touching the sides of the plug, those walls. Would a key make these strange angles, these strange number of marks? Definitely not. If it does make marks, which is possible, because keys are sometimes cut wrong, or the plug may be just too tight for the key or something, there'll be a very uniform type of mark. Not like this, where the angles, as well as the length, the depth, everything is very randomized. The chambers themselves also might have marks. In the photo, you could see that little lip is different. If you compare it with the other two, that's not right. And if we think about, well, could a key ever do this? Well, no, because for the key to get into that area, it'd have to scrape its way through and then be pulled back. So if it was the key, we would see this on all the chamber spacings. And again, here, another example, but I like this one because it's very distinct. We can see that the angle is not something a key would do. We could see that the shape, we could probably figure out what type of pick exactly was used. Again, hopefully materials transferred between the pick and the lock, which can later be identified. High up in the chambers, we might find even more. What this looks like to me is when you're picking a lock, it's fairly easy to find the binding pin, but setting it at the shear line is something that's a little more difficult because of the tolerances of modern day locks. Sometimes it's a hair line that you have to match. And so this is them using their pick up and down trying to find it. And it leaves very distinct marks on places where, remember the pins are normally in this location, so the pins wouldn't be making this mark, or else again, they would leave very uniform marks. The tension tool we use also leaves forensic evidence, and this is one of the easier ones to find with amateurs, again, because of extreme tension. They're basically just cutting into the plug walls when they're doing this, and sometimes you don't even need to cut apart the lock to see this. So you can see in the photo, right here, we see this big line, and maybe a key made that. But if it did, we'd probably be able to identify that, or again, it would go the full length of the keyway, depending on where the mark's made. But if we cut apart the lock, we could see these very distinct marks. The first thing we see, from the people that have picked a lock, how many times when you inserted your tension tool did you have to kind of jiggle it to fit it right? Everybody, right? You don't just stick it in and magic happens. So right here, these small scratches are from where you're seating your tool. And again, the key's not going to do this, especially at this angle. And this is the point where you finally decided to place your tension tool. And that obviously leaves a nice, fresh mark. So light tension, again, we talked about, is something that is more of a better lockpicker would do. But even here, we could see the marks where they jiggled to get into place. And here's the point where they finally decided to apply tension. The cam, the back of the lock that interacts with the bolt, is going to be another place where we may find marks. A skilled attacker will probably know that if they're at the back of the lock, they're not touching a pin. But if you be at DEF CON, I'm sure you'll see somebody picking a lock, and they're sticking the pick out the back, trying to touch the pin tumblers. And it's kind of funny, but it does happen, and it's maybe a lot of marks, may not. Right here we see some scratches in various angles. Again, the key's not going to do that because the keys are normally shoulder stopped. Again, we could determine the skill level sometimes. Again, at the villages, we usually remove the cam and the bolt work because it's just extraneous. It doesn't help us learn to pick the lock, or well, I guess it learns how to make it work. But an amateur attacker will probably be hitting the back and not even notice it, because one of the skills you have to develop as a lock picker is to visualize where your pick is in the lock, so you know you're manipulating this stack, this stack, this stack. A lot of people just jam it all the way and then kind of try and jiggle, but it doesn't work too well, and it leaves a lot of forensic evidence. I've been asked a lot, what about specialized tools for specific locks? Lately, in the last few years, we've seen a lot of specialized tools come out for high security locks. So it's not this thing where we're discovering big classes of attack, but we're breaking individual locks. But those individual locks may secure millions of doors. How many of you have noticed that this hotel uses all the same lock? It's a Slade Primus, if anybody wants to know. And it has a sidebar, and the Medico also has a sidebar. And there's a tool. Medico pins need to also be rotated as well as raised properly. And there's this channel that allows a piece called the sidebar to fall into it so that the lock can rotate. And there's a tool that somebody developed to basically rotate those back and forth. And in the picture, you can see scratch marks where that tool left marks. Again, the key's never going to go here. Even the sidebar itself will never touch here. So these are very clearly marks of lockpicking. How many of you know what a pick gun is? Cool. How many of you know what bumping is? Okay, pick guns and bumping are essentially the same thing. Pick gun just is like a tool that slaps up against the pins and causes them to split in the same way that bumping causes them to split. And at the very small moment when they're split, the plug can be rotated and the lock opened. So pick guns are going to leave not as many marks as lockpicking, but they still leave marks. So again, we're going to see throughout the length of the plug where they may where the needle of the pick gun is inserted. We're going to see marks on the bottoms of the pin where the pick gun slaps against it, possibly on the cam as well if the pick gun's inserted too far and it scrapes against the back of the cam. Pick guns require an additional tension tool, unlike bumping, which uses the key. They require an additional tension tool, just like lockpicking, to turn the lock when it's open. So if we look at this is, I believe it's pick gun is hit it once, twice maybe. we can see these very distinct impact marks right here. And again, that doesn't look like normal wear. That probably is not going to be made by a key, because if a key's scraping against that, we're going to see it on other pins as well. And it would be much less defined than this is. Cool thing about pick guns is, remember we said the key can rotate this. The pick gun, when it's slapping those pins, is also rotating them. So if you've ever bumped, you're probably not going to get the bump on the first try. So you're going to hit it once, twice, maybe 3 times, maybe more. The same applies with pick guns. You don't always just stick it in there and the lock magically opens. Usually takes a couple tries. And what happens is the pins rotate while you're doing this. And you start to develop this bicycle spoke pattern. And with that, you can determine almost down to the exact number how many times a pick gun was used, how long it may have taken them to do entry. Because there's no, well, I guess there is a full auto pick gun. I take that back. Again, on the cam, we might see marks. These marks are also very well defined. They're very good chance that material from the cam got onto the tip of the pick gun. If you ever use a pick gun, I believe I brought one with me for the village at DEF CON if you'd like to try it. You'll see that the needle of the pick gun has a lot of brass and material left on it just because it's impacting these pins very, very strongly. Again, we could count how many times the pick gun was used from this. Hopefully we'll get suspect identification, or link them to the crime, based on material transfer between these. Key bumping is something that caused a big shit a couple years ago, and it's still causing big shits to this day. Black Hat might get mad at me for saying this, but about a month ago, they found out that the locks, the Slade Primus, which, as you may remember, is used on every door in this hotel, in fact can be bumped. It was previously thought that you need the sidebar code as well as the bump key cut to make it work, but there's only one sidebar code for the US, or something retarded where there's only like 4, something like that. So it's very easy to find and make a bump key. And the big shit caused by bumping is that when it first came out, and I'm guilty of this as well as every other bad thing you see in this talk, I'm certainly guilty of, so everyone was like, oh my God, how are insurance companies going to know that a lock was bumped? Because you're using a key, and you're using it like a normal key. Well, you're not really using it like a normal key. And so everyone was kind of worried, and they have a right to be worried because insurance contracts are usually ironclad so that only if this specific thing happens are you covered. So maybe key bumping wasn't covered in some people's insurance contracts, and they have a right to be worried. But the people that would say, well, the insurance companies would never know, that's not true. And I used to tell people, well, if you're going to bump a lock, make sure to throw a brick through the window so that way they're covered. But that obviously just a joke. I would never throw a brick through someone's window after I broke in. I'm just kidding. So again, bumping causes quite a few marks, more than almost any other covert entry technique. And again, I keep forgetting to put a slide in to remember this. When we say covert is something that a normal user probably wouldn't find. So you, as a normal user of your door lock, would probably not notice if your lock was picked. But a forensic investigator, a forensic locksmith, would almost certainly be able to identify it. Destructive entry is something that everyone can notice. Either your lock isn't working, or there's a hole in your wall, so on and so forth. And then surreptitious entry is something that a normal user and a forensic locksmith would be unable to identify. And there's very few techniques that are actually surreptitious, but we'll get into that later. So we expect to find bumping on all these different places. Number one, we're going to find it on the pins. You've all bumped a lock? Basically, you hit a specially modified key into the lock, and it leaves quite a bit of evidence. The impact against all those pins is going to leave very large dents that are very distinct from almost every other type of entry technique. And there's one example. Keys filed by hand might have very distinct filing patterns on the ridges of the key that might also scratch. And later we can identify if a specific key was used, potentially, based on matching this specific tool mark pattern to a suspect's key. I like to use alternate lighting, and you'll see it throughout the talk. I have like 10 lights all on this one desk, and it's helpful to find different kinds of marks with different light sources. And so here's like just a normal desk lamp compared to usually most of these are LED light because it's actually a lot better. But here's a normal desk lamp. And you can see here we could pretty distinctly identify all the different bumping marks, especially up here at the top. We see 2 distinct marks, a lot of different scratches. Again, none of these really look like normal wear. Even with the fucked up key, these really don't look like anything that's normal, and they are in fact bumping. What's kind of cool is that different designs of pins will bump differently. They all usually have that same trademark impact on the bottom, but between the top and the bottom pin, there are a lot of different things. And so in this particular lock, the top and the bottom of the pin is rounded so that as a locksmith or as somebody personally rekeying your own lock, you can insert it either way and not have to worry about it. It's for convenience. But that round mating surface with the top pin actually causes a giant dent in the bottom of the top pin. How many of you have bumped and it didn't work? Most of you, right? It's very rare that it just works immediately and it does happen though, and luckily those are all the ones we get on video. But when it doesn't work, what happens? Where does all that energy go? It doesn't just disappear. What normally ends up happening is that instead of those top pins magically jumping like in the animations, they basically impact the chamber walls. And they'll cause these light shear marks along the base of the top pin, potentially even the top of the bottom pin if we have an improperly cut bump key. What's kind of neat, this is a serrated pin. So in the last picture you saw that there's a distinct spacing between those, and that's to frustrate lockpicking. Again, go to the village. If there's anything in the stock you're not sure about, visit the DEF CON lockpicking village, and we'd be happy to clarify it for you. This lock was bumped so many times that the serration closed, effectively defeating, or at least helping to defeat, the anti-lockpicking of this lock. It's just something I thought was very interesting. Again, you could still see the marks where there were failed bumpings at both the top and the bottom of the serrations. So we said when bumps fail, the pins are basically slamming against the plug walls. And so what does that do? It basically distorts the chambers. Again, we talked about why does lockpicking work? Because of manufacturing tolerances. Well, this is also contributing to that problematic tolerance between the pins and the chambers and everything to help make, not to make lockpicking work, but to make it easier to bind, easier to cause these defects. And it's just something interesting that also shows up when you bump. The face of the lock, again, we talked about earlier what it looks like for normal wear. This is like the lock I've brought to every conference in the last 5 years, and everybody and their grandmother has bumped it, sometimes literally and their grandmother. And so you can see that there's a huge impact mark on the face of the lock. Here's another one. And what's happening is when we bump a lock, we're hitting it into the lock, or we're hitting the key into the lock, and that's causing impact where that piece is normally stopped. And so that's going to cause a huge dent. There's various techniques to stop this. But again, you're still going to leave marks on the inside, still going to stretch those pin chambers, so on. Does anybody have a key out? You're going to regret it later, but does anybody have a key out? If you look at your key, you'll see that as it goes toward the handle, the bow of the key, the material starts to thicken, and that's because it wants to be durable at that point where you're turning. There's a technique called minimal movement bumping where we allow the key to go slightly farther into the lock. So when we do that, we're allowing that thicker part of the key to enter into the keyway. And when we're bumping, we're basically stretching out the keyway very, very slightly. So you can see around the rim of the keyway here, the material is a little distorted. And that's something that's probably not going to happen in normal wear, again, because we're shoulder stopped. How many of you know what impressioning is? Cool. Impressioning is basically a technique where we take a key and it sounds strange, but we jiggle the key in the lock to determine what the correct cuts are. And if you, we could give a whole talk on impressioning alone, but come to the village and we'll explain this more. But basically what we're doing is applying extreme tension and jiggling the key, and the pins will all be stuck because of the tension we're putting on them. And they will leave marks on the key, and we file down the key, so on, until we have a working key for the lock. And so we expect to find marks primarily on the top of the bottom pin. And it's caused by us shearing those pins forcibly and purposefully against the plug in the cylinder. And so it causes all these little marks. And what's kind of neat is that we could actually determine how many rounds, they call it rounds of impressioning, the lock went through. We could determine, how skilled they were. Somebody could look up the keying specifications to determine, so we impression a key, we find a mark in pin 1, right? We file down, but if you look up the keying specifications, you can file directly to the next available cut. So you don't have to do it, a very, very light amount at a time. You can do it purposefully to just cut it down to quickly impression the lock. And so if we see in the last photo, these are all pretty closely spaced. So that's somebody who probably didn't have the keying specifications for this lock. And most of this information is public for most locks. And here's very spaced out marks. So these, again, are something that would imply that they were better at impressioning than, say, the person in the last photo. This forcible rotation of the plug with our key is going to stretch out those pin chambers, because this is much more force than when, say, you put the wrong key in and you jiggle it. This is much more force than that. And in the photo, we could see that laterally, the pin chambers are stretching out. This is one of my personal favorite things is called ultraviolet impressioning. It's where we coat the impressioning key with ultraviolet ink, and it makes it a lot easier to identify marks left by the pins. I believe I'll be doing a mini talk in the village on all sorts of impressioning techniques, including I brought my badass $7 eBay black light to do this with. So if you want to catch that, that'd probably be interesting to you too. So we're coating the entire key with UV ink. It's going to leave a lot of UV on the face of the lock as well as all over the pins. And if you look right about here, you can see that these are pretty distinct key tracks from where that UV coated key is being inserted and removed from the lock. Decoding is really hard to define. It's basically lockpicking will open a lock for you, correct? Impressioning makes a working key for you. Decoding doesn't necessarily do either of those. What it does is give you the information to produce a working key, but not necessarily the means to do it. Because a very high security lock will have a hard to reproduce key, either by hand or by machine. And so decoding gives you that information, but you may not necessarily be able to make a working key. There's this idea of the decoder pick. So when we set a pin at the shear line with our picking tool, maybe we can have a tool to feel where that is, and from there we could decode the depths of each component. Again, safe cracking by manipulation. I'm sure you've all seen this in a movie. That's where they jiggle the combination dial and somehow it magically opens. That is a surreptitious technique. The decoder pick obviously is going to leave the same marks as a normal pick, but you're just basically measuring when that stops. This idea of visual and optical decoding. Any of you have your keys on your neck, on your pants, out? Can anybody around you see your keys? You guys are too smart for this. Basically, I could look at your key just by sight and possibly determine the bitting code. Most of your keys will have a code that is the direct number for each cut on the key. I guarantee all of you have a key like this in your pocket right now, so don't bring it out, it'll be scary. There's also this idea of surveillance, optical, so on. Thermal decoding is where we use heat imaging to determine, say, a keypad lock, I feel bad, like they have on all the doors here, to determine which were the last ones pushed. We could also use UV ink for this to determine where the UV ink left is obviously the numbers they pushed. Radiological is using it's basically, in layman's terms, taking an x-ray of the lock. And it doesn't work against all locks. It's primarily against combination safes to take a picture of where all the components are to determine the correct combination. There's also, of course, disassembly. If you could disassemble a lock, you could directly measure all the components to determine what the key should look like. A lot of pinning kits and self-free keying kits at Home Depot, as well as used by a lot of locksmiths, color the pins to make it easier to identify which components you want to use. Obviously, these are outside the lock to make it easier for me to take a picture of, but we could use a bore scope or an otoscope or anything to look in the lock, possibly identify the bitting code based on the colors. Some locks, just by looking at them, you could determine what their code is. In really crappy wafer locks, they'll actually sit at different positions. And so with, again, a borescope, autoscope, we could determine what the correct key should look like. So I go to a lot of conferences and I stay at a lot of hotels, and all the hotels have safes. And 9 out of 10 of them let me physically disassemble the safe as well as the safe lock. I'm not going to tell you what hotel this is, and this isn't from where I'm staying at now in case any of those security facilities are here. But you could completely disassemble lots of locks. You know, it's not hard to do, and if you do it quickly, somebody may never notice. You know, how long do you think like this door could have the lock missing for before somebody noticed? Probably a couple hours, especially during conferences when nobody's using that door. And from this, well, what if the safes in the hotel are master keyed? I could certainly decode the master keying information, and then I have a key that works on all the safes. So these are big problems, but it's fundamentally things that are hard for hotels and apartments and other things to prevent. Bypasses this idea. With picking, we're defeating the cylinder of the plug in we're defeating the security of the plug in the cylinder. Bypass goes directly to restricting the bolt or some other form of attack that doesn't touch or doesn't affect the integrity of the locking cylinder. So how many of you have seen a movie where they put something under the door and catch the handle and then pull the handle from the back of the door? That would be a bypass tool. And that's called, if you want to know, an under-the-door tool. The most common form of attack is a cam, the bolt-work actuator, that is where movement is unrestricted. So you could just put a tool in there and turn the cam yourself instead of turning the plug with it. The best example is this American 700 lock, and if you've ever been to a lockpicking talk, I'm sure you've seen the story of this lock. It had this exact problem where this cam piece in the back, it only rotates 90 degrees, and so that right half is where the lock would go. And when the lock rotated, it'd take it with it. But there's this nice, pretty space for us to insert a tool and flip it manually. And again, in this photo, that's what's been done. And you can see the tool marks, very distinct scratches along the sides of the key, or excuse me, the sides of the cam. So American invented this idea. Well, fuck you guys. We're going to put, they actually made a tiny metal disc with its own serial number and everything to put there so that nobody could rotate the cam. So here's an example of, with the cam, that's what the tool mark would look like. Obviously, if it had the cam and it wasn't damaged, then we could say, well, their entry was unsuccessful in this method, at the very least. After this, which I don't have a picture of yet, somebody developed a tool that's basically a small hammer, and you hammer away this metal piece, and then you have a nice spot to put your old tool back in and restrict the cam again. It's a cool story. Eventually, they ended up redesigning the lock. Some of you may have been at the Black Hat training for lockpicking, physical security, beginner to expert. We had this code lock, and there's a vulnerability that's kind of known privately that there's a bypass for this. And so we were like, oh, Babak, I should give credit. Babak has had this lock for years, and he's known there's a bypass, but he never figured it out. So he sat down, I believe it was Monday night, and they bought a $1 notebook, little tiny notebooks that you have spiral bound. And he noticed, the only place we have access to this lock, besides the traditional keyway, is this little hole right here. And that's a drainage hole. And most padlocks, even a lot of door locks, have a drainage hole. And so what he found out was, that's interesting. It's a straight path to the actuator and the bolt work through this hole. And that piece in the center there is actually attached to the handle, and it picks up when the correct key is inserted, or excuse me, the correct combination is inserted. The electronics will engage this. So what he found out is you could just stick, you take your spiral bound notebook thing out, you straighten it out, you stick it in there, it will shear between this actuator and the handle, and you can turn the handle and retract the bolt without ever touching the electronic lock and leaving an audit trail, and without ever touching the door cylinder, as it's a manual physical override, and leaving picking marks or impression marks or any of that there. So I was sitting in on the class, luckily, And so everyone was like, hey, you're that forensics guy. Why don't you forensics this, dick? And so that's paraphrased how it went. And and so I had my camera, and I was like, oh, sure, no problem. And I took it outside. And first thing I noticed is that there's a lot of material removal from where that wire is. It's basically displacing something else. And it's scraping off a lot of material. And if you look at the top of it where the tool never touches, there's no material. So again, this may, obviously I don't have the crime lab here with me on vacation, but this may be from their wire, and it also is, I would say, probably more likely from the lock. But the money shot, if you will, is the tool marks they left behind on the actuator. And that is obviously not a microscope shot, but it's macro photography, very distinct number of marks, those angle of marks, depth of marks. That's something that I could say, well, this lock has been manipulated in some way other than through the key or the combination. We only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to run through this real quick. Again, we can talk about this outside if you guys want, but keys are also very important. We need to look at the material of the keyway, the cuts, any codes that may be on it to determine if it's susceptible to decoding just by looking at the code directly. We want to know if it's an original or a duplicate. It's usually a big thing, whether it was made by hand or a machine. If it was recently cut, copied, and any material transfer that be on it. So plating is kind of a neat thing because it helps us determine if it's original or duplicate. Sorry, I'm going to talk fast because I just want to get through this real quick. So a plated blank will usually have the bitting plated as well. And then when a locksmith cuts it, he takes away that plating. Factory original will cut the key and then plate it. And so it's different depending on the manufacturer. But with this, we might be able to identify if it's the original or the duplicate or where it was duplicated and so on and so forth. So I'm going to spoil this for you, but this is an original key. And we can see that the slopes are very, very precise. The valleys are very flat. In this one, this is a duplicate. We see they're a little, not quite the same, a little jagged, a little less level. When you duplicate from your local hardware store, and there's obviously lots more methods to duplicate a key than this, but this is one of the most common ones. When you give them your key to duplicate, they basically put in a little machine, and they put a blank next to it, and a little, it's called the stylus. It's a little wheel rides your key to determine the cuts, and then an associated cutter will cut that same pattern. And that basically scrapes against your key very lightly, and it leaves this mark. Handmade keys are pretty easy to spot, only because it's very hard to get either the cut centered properly, the valleys spaced properly, the slopes angled properly. Usually very, very easy to spot. Keys that are filed, obviously we're going to leave filing marks on the keys themselves. From that we can determine the size of the file, the shape of the file, the grade of the file, almost everything about the file that was used. Again, Dremels, very similar, obviously different marks than hand filing a key. We can also determine the speed of the machine used to cut your key. And if you look at your keys at the very end near the bow, there's this area that the pins never touch. And from there we can see the different markings made by the cutting wheels. And on the left is a low-speed key cutter. On the right is a very high-speed key cutter. Again, here's just a comparison. Even after wear, we could usually determine the speed of the cutting wheel that made it. Bumping, again, is going to leave quite a few marks on the key itself, just because we're impacting those components. And it's a reciprocal marking. So we're going to see that there's actually pin marks on the ridges of the key. The shoulder of the key itself is usually going to be displaced a bit. We're also going to find tool marks for various other things. It's kind of uncommon. How many of you have ever held your tools or held your keys in a tool? It's not a very common thing to do. So here we see, well, what's that mark? And what's that mark? It's a very deep, distinct mark. So when we look at it up close, those are vice grip marks. And vice grips are very commonly used in impressioning. And again, we can examine the bitting of the key itself to determine, well, was it filed by hand, was it Dremeled, so on and so forth. We might also find material residue. Something I don't really touch on is to impression a key with clay or silicone or whatever. So here we find some clay residue on the key. Here we find some wax residue, again, for the same reason. Here we find some ultraviolet residue, as well as we could see that's a handmade key because it's obviously doesn't look like a real key. So there's, actually I got to skip this. We already talked about this. Basically every anti-forensic lockpicking tool I've tried has not worked. And I'm not aware of any commercially that do work. It's just a very hard thing to do. Safes and vaults are kind of a talk on their own. Basically we're focusing on the points where drills were used, any writing or marking, any magnetic or adhesive residue we might find, and any associated tool marks. Obviously, safes, kind of from the American perspective, are always combination safes, but that's not necessarily true. They could use all the same types of locks that we use on all the other places we use locks. It's just that combinations are convenient and very widely used. One thing that's really important is this idea of drill points. So a lot of people, what they try and do, which to me is kind of funny, is that they'll just take a drill and make some holes in the front, back, wherever of their safe, and they assume that they could get away with insurance fraud on it. But it's actually a very precise art, and it's very different from safe to safe where you're supposed to drill, or where you even can drill to possibly affect entry. And so a forensic locksmith will evaluate all this to determine if it was possible, if there's a hole here, can it be used to determine the combination or unlock the bolt or so on and so forth. Unfortunately, we don't have time for the investigative process. But if you'd like to talk to me outside, we could go over that. The website also has a much more thorough breakdown of the investigative process. There are people who do licensing and certification for this. They're a well-known organization called the International Association of Investigative Locksmiths. However, I've been referring people since I made the website to them for certification, and almost every single one of them has come back and said that they're not the IAIL told them they weren't offering certification. I'm not part of the IAIL, so I don't know what's up with that. They also, I've also been referring them for training, but they said that they're not offering training either. So if you want me to train you, I'd be very happy to. Obviously, this is just a brief overview. There's a lot more we could get into just on locks and safes themselves, let alone forensics. So I always hate it when people put like 1,000 links and everybody scrambles to write them. So you could go to Lockpicking Forensics. That's a site I made. Again, as far as I know, it's the only site that has this information on the internet. If you have any more, I'd be more than happy to add them to my resources page and add them to the talk. There's also LockWiki is another site I run, which is obviously a wiki about locks. It's kind of sparse on forensics information, but after the conference, I'll get home and update it for you guys. There's also the links page on Lockpicking Forensics, as well as LockWiki, that has a lot of other places you might want to go. And this talk, as well as the white paper, are both on your CDs that you got, so don't feel obligated to scribble everything down. That's all I have. Thank you.